Hello and welcome back to 4th Age Guides. Today we are taking a look at the Kingdom of Adunabar on the battlefield, and I thought what better way to do a guide video for the battle prospects for the Kingdom of Adunabar than by actually showing what is likely to be the first and potentially most critical battle of the campaign. So what I've done here is I've taken out my faction leader and all his forces from Minas Ithil, sent him right on the bridge at Osgiliath, and I have augmented that with a few troops from Emyn Arnon. Not all of them, but a few of them. I've just marched about 4 or 5 guys up here. The reason I've left some behind is because, well, in part public order, but also because if you have a completely full stack on the bridge, it seems to be the case that the Reunited Kingdom will not take the bait. So you do need to have a somewhat even force. Now, they send some of their absolute best troops here. You will find men-at-arms, King's Spearmen, King's Longbowmen, and most terrifying, the 3 units of Company of the Guard. These are 3 completely unique units that you can't train, actually, as the Reunited Kingdom, but you can retrain at Minas Anor. So taking these out early in the campaign is going to be great. They're also very likely to send these Citadel catapults at you. You, of course, have catapults of your own. So let's get into the fight and see how this might look. Because one of the things that is going to help you in this is actually not treating this battle like a typical bridge battle. And the reason for that is the enemy is going to bring catapults. They will be able to bombard you right from the starting position if you deploy your troops right next to the bridge, which is going to be your inclination. Because after all, you have some very heavy troops, you've got some ranged, and the instinct is going to be to deny the enemy that crossing and surround them. But if you set up right by the bridge, what's going to happen is the enemy is going to just shoot you to pieces. So what I want to do is have my catapults set up so that I can hit them just as they are getting off the bridge. So I'm watching that red arrow turn green. Right now that's happening right on the land side of the bridge. Maybe a little bit further forward so I can hit them as they cross, something like that. We'll see. We also want to make sure the catapult is set to shoot at nearest enemy, fire at will in other words, and we want to use the flaming ammo. This is absolutely killer against infantry especially, but really any troops on the battlefield. You want to use the normal ammo against buildings, but the flaming ammo against enemy troops. And this, because you begin the campaign with a lot of cultic troops and a lot of cultic influence, you're going to see these cultic catapult crew, essentially. They're not going to be as hardy as crew members as others, but that doesn't really matter. You don't get them to get into melee. Now you do have a melee line here. I'm just going to go ahead and set them all up like a typical line, with the exception of the Grim Spears. We're going to have those guys kind of in the black for doing some flanking work. I think I do want some Spears of the Shadow just in front of the catapult. They're going to be okay there, and everything else is going to be pretty standard. Now we've got 4 units of archers all together, and I will have them out front, I guess. That may also induce the enemy to attack me. They're going to head back behind the lines. Maybe I'll have the Grim Spears here. I took the Governor of Emyn Arnon. Now he is a bodyguard unit, but instead of these Adunabar nobles, which are your typical bodyguard, you can train eventually at Emyn Arnon these black companies. So these are sort of a counterpoint to the white company. Infantry, archers, swords, I believe, for a secondary weapon. Very good archers, but of course you want to keep them back from the fighting, and you also don't want to let them get shot up. So what you can do with them is keep them back behind the lines and use them potentially in a flanking role, but you do want to be kind of careful. If they get caught up in melee, or especially a cavalry charge, that's not going to be good. Our bodyguard unit is these Adunabar nobles. These are what your family members are going to come of age as, although Adunabar does get several different options for bodyguards, as we will see. Now, all cavalry bodyguards in the mod are set to skirmish, even if they don't have ranged weapons. This is sort of to protect the AI, especially, but you want to take them off skirmish yourself. We also have a couple of other heavy cavalry units. These Shadow Riders are the more common. They are the heaviest cultic cavalry you can train. For the most part, although you do have a special unit, a different version of them, Shadow Guard, which have the emblem, the insignia that is going to inspire nearby troops. These are a, let's see, Shadow Guard. These are a one-shot unit, much like those guards of the Citadel that we, or the Company of the Guard that we saw in the Reunited Kingdoms ranks. You also begin play with one unit of Shadow Guard that you will never be able to train yourself, but you can retrain in Minas Ithil if you upgrade that. So you want to, obviously keep track of these guys so they don't get completely eliminated in a fight. The lighter cav available to the cultic roster of Adunabar is these Horsemen of the Shades. Fairly intimidating looking, but they're relatively light for cavalry. They at least have spears, so that is helpful. But they're not going to be standing too long in a typical fight. Let's look at the rest of our infantry line. If you're playing as the cultic roster of Adunabar, you're going to have limited archery options. So these dark bows are going to be basically what you're going to have. Fortunately, they're excellent. They're not quite longbowmen, but they've got good armor and they've got swords as a melee weapon. So you can absolutely use them as a flanking unit. Use them in a melee at a pinch, and I probably will have to use them in that role here. Other cultic units would include these Spears of the Shadow. These are a tier 3, I believe, unit, so very strong spearmen. Definitely have a couple units of these in your armies, but like most of these troops, they're extremely expensive. Your most cost-effective units are going to be these dark bows for the most part. Swords of the Shadow are another, I believe, tier 3 unit. Very good melee, as you might imagine. No frills, like they don't have any special abilities, but they've got good morale and they will serve you very well. Black Shields, I believe these are not a cultic unit, but a Ways of the West unit. And again, when it comes to Adunabar, you have the choice whether your faction is going to be cultic or Ways of the West. We went over that in the campaign video, so do give that a look. That basically means some of these units will be available for training at certain times, others will not. At the beginning of the campaign, cultic units will be the ones you can train. Black Shields, though, are a bit different in that they can go into the shield wall formation, which actually I may go ahead and do right now just to kind of keep them lined up here. Go ahead and put them on guard formation along with everybody here just to maintain their stamina. A tier 2 unit for Cultic Adunabar, melee infantry, is Dark Swords. Very nice. They've got these axes sort of at their belts, which they don't use in the game, but the idea is that they are very good in the attack, so that's what that is intended to signify. We got some more Swords of the Shadow over here, and then the very basic garrison-type troops are Grim Spears. These are, again, a cultic unit for Adunabar. I said garrison, but actually they're pretty expensive. Let's have a look at the upkeep. That's 230. So you're actually going to get a lot of use out of them on the battlefield. Don't be afraid to train them and send them into the fight. And they're better fighting than guarding the walls. So that's all that we have here in this battle. So we're going to see how the Reunited Kingdom progresses. And now you can see that their catapult is essentially out of the fight. They're not going to be able to cross the bridge with it, I don't believe. Or at least they never do in this battle whenever I play it. And so this is going to be the last unit that you will have to deal with once you've beaten their actual army. We do outnumber them, but that's a very good thing because these Company of the Guard are going to be tough nuts to crack. So let's speed up the fight here and see how things go. We're just about getting into catapult range. And let's see if anything comes of this. And it does. We did a few losses of those Company of the Guard. Gonna come up short with that shot, and we go a little wide there. We will have to babysit the catapults a bit in this fight because as the enemy units get closer, we're not going to want to let them choose their own targets. We're probably going to be shooting at their longbowmen as that goes on. So at this point, we'll just let them do that. Come on, catapults, you're embarrassing me here. You're just falling short. There we go. That was pretty good. What did that hit? Was that Guards of the Citadel? Company of the Guard? Yeah, I think that took out a lot of them. About half of that unit. So very good stuff there. Now they're trying to flank, but they're going to stop trying once they start coming under fire. So that's totally fine. The main thing here is to make sure that we get these Company of the Guard surrounded in the melee, and then we'll get our cavalry around to outflank them. So now we want to make sure that we're aiming at units that are gonna be likely to hit. So let's hit those company of the guard, that Kingdom militia. So that's their low-tier militia troops. They just routed once they came into contact with the bowmen. That's great. These bowmen are continuing to fight. All right, let's see if that's going to do anything. And it is a direct hit. Took out half of them in one shot. Very nice. So we've already got some routing going on, which is great news because it's going to make it easier for them just in general to rout. We're also hitting the Gondorian Horseman bodyguard unit. It's looking a little vulnerable there. I am considering sending my cav over to take him out. Let's get these guys over here so we can hit the Kingdom militia unit with 2 cavalry units. There they come running after our archers. That's our opportunity to hit them with the cav. So we're just holding up the line here, and we're going to do fairly well there. The militia's gone, and now we need to be thinking about what to do next. The King's Spearmen present something of a problem. And so now we need to choose some different targets for the catapult, because those company of the guard are all engaged with our melee line. That's not going to work, obviously. Alright, the enemy general is gone, or at least routed away, and he's not a concern anymore, so now we need to deal with the longbowmen. And I'm just running these spearmen around. Hopefully they're going to be getting shot in the back. We can use these guys for these grim spears just for flanking purposes. Alright, so the spearmen are getting into our back line a bit. That's okay. I'm going to take these guys off guard mode. I think it might help them to get some more kills now that we're in a pretty decent position. Alright, so let's turn the cav around. And as always, I like to make my cavalry charges really count by waiting for the cavalry to stop moving before I charge. I don't just get them in the general area and then have them charge. I make sure they're all lined up, so they're still forming up. And these guys, you know, you maybe have to worry about them a little less than some other units, but you know it's a good charge when they lower their lances like this. They're going to hit the back. I expect them to rout fairly soon because the general's gone. Yes, indeed. And now we need to pull them back because we don't want them to stand around getting hit by those other company of the guard units. All right, we got 52 of them in this group. Let's hit them anyway and see if we can do some damage. And here we've got some spearmen that are not actually fighting anyone. So we're going to be choosing targets now. And that was actually it for the company of the guard. So they have now routed, and we can use our cavalry to essentially clean that up. Alright, everyone is routing here, so that's great. And now, well, except for these men-at-arms, they're winning easily, but I think we do have the cavalry to deal with it. Let's send the lighter cav to chase the routers, and I'll send my general to hit the men-at-arms in the back. These cav are going to go after the citadel catapults. Hopefully they won't get a shot off. Alright, and again, we want to wait for the cavalry to form up in a pretty decent position, and then hit the men-at-arms in the back. And that's enough to do it. So there they go. Over here, we've got the crew for the citadel catapults. They're routing, and that's that. So we'll just end the battle here because I guess we can take a look at the statistics. But essentially that did everything that you would want to do. In the real campaign, you would definitely want to run down every last router and make sure they all get away. But what that does is it essentially opens up the Anduin for your troops to pass right over the bridge, besiege minus Honor, which now has a skeleton garrison consisting essentially of their faction leader and maybe one or two other minor garrison troops. And then you can just proceed from there. So what I want to do next, captured a battle standard because that was one of those company of the guard units. So what I want to do next, yeah, so this is all you'd have to face, and since you've got catapults, you could just go over here, theoretically auto-calc it, which I would probably do here, and you have only taken about 30 or so losses, and you've conquered minus honor. Now, that's a bit anticlimactic because there is actually an excellent little battle map for minus honor, but just for the purposes of showing you how that works, I wanted to do that. Let's now take a look, though, at some of the other units available to the Kingdom of Adunabar, because what we saw there is not it. We want to go to a custom battle screen, and I'll just bring them up. We're not going to actually go into a battle here. So Adunabar, again, has probably more units than any other faction in the mod. It would take me at least 3 battles to show them all. We saw some of them in that other battle. I just want to cover some of our other options here, and I do want to do this somewhat thematically. I want to go through Orc/Beast units, and then I want to take a look at Dunedainic kind of units that would be available to you if you converted to the ways of the West, and then I want to look at sort of mannish cultic units, and we'll look at those all separately. So starting with the Orcs here, we've got your basic Orcs. Orc Raiders along with Snaga Hunters are also available at that very lowest tier, Snaga Hunters here. So you've got, in those Orc forts, you've got these barely worth recruiting Orc Raiders because they're melee and they don't have any ranged capability, and their attack is 1 and their defense is bad. You got low morale, so I would not use them. Just about every time I would take the Snaga Hunters. But if for some reason you thought you needed some melee orcs, orclings like this, then I guess you could train them. But these will be available at the first tier in those orc forts in Mordor or up in the Misty Mountains, any place that you have an orc hold. Eventually, in the next tier, you'll be able to train some more generally useful orc units. That would include these orc hunters. Definitely an improvement on the Snaga variety because orc hunters have a spear as a backup weapon, and they just have a bit better attack overall. Still not a priority, and if you want garrison troops, Snaga hunters are going to be the better bet just for cost. But these guys could see some use. Similarly, the orc band is a somewhat decent unit with spears or polearms and a shield, a bit of armor, and you can use them to some effect against riders, especially light riders. But again, there's better units to do that. I would honestly, if you're cultic, you're going to have Grim Spears. They're going to be vastly better, I would think, than these orc bands, in terms of the morale at any rate. But the most useful unit, probably of all, for your orcish troops are going to be these orc champions. They've got Warcry. They're effective against armor, and that really says it all. The only thing that you need to worry about with them is that they have relatively low defense compared to all of your mannish troops, and they don't have a shield. So they're always going to be vulnerable to ranged units, so keep them away from arrow fire. But really, there's 121 of them in a unit. If you take losses, that's not a problem. They're there basically to hack down the enemy, especially armored enemies or the general. So send them in for that role. They're very cost-effective there. At higher tiers, you start to get into Orcs. You have things like Uruk Swords, which are another Warcry unit, not armor-piercing like the Orc Champions, but just a more defensive unit, kind of a middle of the road, right? They're not like a spear unit that can hold a charge for very long, but they do have a bit of attack ability and a bit better armor and a shield. And Uruk Spears, no Warcry here, but these are going to be much more reliable than, say, your Orc Band. Also, you can get Uruk Guard, which are sort of dedicated cavalry killers. They've got a polearm, pretty good armor, but not the best defense overall due to that lack of a shield. So again, if you want to have like a unit or two in your armies to have a relatively cheap unit that's dedicated to killing cavalry, this might be good for you. And one of my favorite orc units is the Uruk Berserkers. So these are a berserk unit. This is very rare in the 4th Age. Rune gets a unit that can go berserk, and Adunabar gets a unit that can go berserk, and I think that's it. So these are a very rare unit. They, of course, have a fear effect, which is, so far, none of the other orcs have had that. They are very vulnerable, though. Their defense is very low. They do have 2 hit points, but you're definitely not going to want to let them stand around and get shot at, that's for sure. So those are the orc units, but we do have some other beast types that are a bit further down. So let's take a look at those. You have 3 warg units as Adunabar. You have wargs, just the basic wargs themselves. Warg riders, which are going to see a bit better attack and considerably better defense, as well as the charge is the same. Both of these units, by the way, all of your warg units are going to scare horses and are going to be fast. So if you want some fast, light, cheap kind of quasi-cavalry, these are great. So wargs and warg riders, it just depends on which one you're going to be using for melee purposes. If you want to stick around in the melee, the warg riders are good. But sending them against cavalry might be useful, especially en masse. And your third warg unit is warg archers. So they've got essentially lesser arcs. It's like mounted Snaga archers, essentially, but on top of wargs. So this is kind of your only horse archer option as a Adunabar. So definitely make use of that. Again, you can find these beast-type units in orc holds. I think the wargs are limited more to the Misty Mountains range. And you have a couple of troll units. The lower version is the hill trolls, and the more well-armored version are the Olog High. And so the hill trolls, these have 3 hit points, and the Olog High have 4. Otherwise, their stats are somewhat comparable, although the Olog High are going to get a bit better attack and defense, and a bit better charge as well. But these are both scary units. It's nice to have one in an army, but it's not it's not completely necessary. One thing to remember, though, is that these guys do act as siege weapons, so you can use them to instantly assault a city if you have one in your forces. Speaking of siege weapons, let's just go down here and explain this. So you've got really 4 siege weapons, but it's really just basically 2 types. So you've got catapults for the cultic version of you and for the Ways of the West version. And you've got ballistas, again, for the cult versus for the Ways of the West roster. And it's going to be the same kind of performance out of these units, whether you're cultic or not. The difference is that the crew is going to be better defended in the Ways of the West version. Not that that's a huge deal, honestly. Let's continue in the cultic vein. Cultists themselves are a kind of a niche unit. They can chant, which is going to improve the morale of nearby troops. I would argue that this is not useful most of the time as a Adunabar unless you are playing, let's say, a very orc-heavy army, where the orc morale is going to be notably lower than those of your Manish forces. So in that case, cultists might be good to keep them in line. Otherwise, if you're only using a few orcs, like say you've got a few orc champions and some trolls, if they rout, it doesn't really matter too much. So I wouldn't necessarily be quick to use a unit of cultists in your forces unless you've got a very orc-centric army that you're just running out as sort of like battle fodder. But if that's the case, you're probably not going to spend too much time trying to keep them in the field. It might be fun to have a unit in a battle, though, just in case, especially if you're worried about facing a superior foe, which may happen especially in the early game. Skipping over a bit, we talked about Grim Spears and Dark Swords. This Grim Spears, of course, is your Tier 1 basic militia-style unit, but I don't want to underestimate. I don't want you to underestimate these guys. They are pretty effective in battle, and in the early game, and well into the mid-game, actually, I find myself recruiting Grim Spears because they're relatively cheap, and they're available in most places. Any place that you have a military development, you can get them. So, yeah, you can use them, and they will perform better than you may expect. At Tier 2, though, Dark Swords are a step up in terms of defense, in terms of attack, and you're definitely going to want a few units of these for your cultic forces. Another bodyguard unit, this is a cultic bodyguard unit, would be Black Numenorians. This is a unit that you do share with Harad, and I believe you would need to train these out of Umbar. So this is an interesting unit. This becomes a family member when you train it. The advantage of the unit is that it's well armored, it's got good morale, it's got those long swords. It's just a very cool looking unit. The disadvantage is because it's infantry and because it doesn't have a shield, they may be vulnerable to like cavalry charges, to ranged attacks, so you do have to be somewhat careful about them. You don't want to let them get charged or shot down, so use them as a flanking force, or if you're supporting them with other units in a charge, they can be a lot of fun. Grondsman, this is a great unit. So this is a slightly larger than typical Manish size unit that you can only train out of Barad Eden. So that is just to the east of Mount Doom. It's the settlement that is basically built on or near the old ruins of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, of course. So this is a Grondsmen. It's a very fun unit. So they've got these hammers, and the whole sort of backstory we developed for them is sort of that they were based on or influenced by or maybe worshipping Grond, right? That great magical siege ram that Sauron had constructed in the assault of Minas Tirith. So Grondsmen are large. There's sort of an implication that they might be mixed with trolls or greater Orcs or something along those lines to get them to that surprisingly large size. They're frightening because of that. Their hammers mean that they are effective against armor, so definitely worth upgrading Barad Eden and going with a military policy there so you can get these guys. We already talked about Swords of the Shadow, a very solid tier 3 unit. Axes of the Shadow, you do start with some of these out in the east, right in your capital actually, Lond Nurnen, which is in the east of Mordor. So these are, sort of an Eastern-inspired unit, I suppose, with two-handed axes, making them effective against armor. You're going to want to use them situationally again because they don't have shields, and although they are very well armored, they are going to take some losses in melee and against ranged units and against cavalry. So you want to have them charging into preferably a foe that's already engaged. Spears of the Shadow are, I believe, a tier 3, maybe 4 actually, but I guess I can't remember that. But in any case, Spears of the Shadow are a very, very solid unit, very, very expensive, but great defense, good morale. They are going to hold out for a very long time indeed, so highly recommended to get them. Stonecutters. So these are available, I believe, in dwarven settlements that you upgrade. So if you get them to, I believe, the highest level of military development, you could get some stonecutters. These are similar in fighting style to the Black Númenóreans. You can get some, I guess the nearest place would be either if you go to the Blue Mountains or north of Mordor, right near the Sea of Rune, there is that one dwarven settlement, Nereg Zigil. So that's not too far out of your range if you're going up that way. I think that's it for cultic units at this part of the screen, but we also have the Dark Bows. Again, a very solid unit at tier 2. Use them as a hybrid, and they will serve you very well. Only a couple more cultic units here. Bows of the Shadow, this is what you can train in Elven territories. There's not really a great need for you to go attacking the elves. But if you do, if you want to conquer Lorien and the Grey Havens and so on, you certainly can do that. And your reward for doing so would be these Bows of the Shadow, which are sort of filling a gap in the cultic roster, and that is having effective long-range troops. So these guys are going to be well-armored. They're going to have long bows. They're also going to have a two-handed axe as a melee weapon. That makes them a pretty interesting and versatile unit, so I would recommend that if you want to go and tangle with the elves on their home territory, which if you do, you probably want to bring a lot of trolls and catapults and things to try to make life easier for you. Knights of the Dark Tree, this is another bodyguard unit that you can train. So very similar in playstyle to your normal bodyguard unit, the Adunabar Nobles, which you will tend to just get naturally. We talked about Horsemen of the Shades and Shadow Riders, and I think that takes us up to all of the cultic units that Adunabar can train, and now we'll go back and look at some of the Ways of the West. The Ways of the West units for Adunabar are typically a bit more versatile. They're also a bit more local, so you tend to get more local variety based on where you conquer when you're doing that. The Ways of the West path for Adunabar. So one of these is Mariners. These are a very good hybrid unit. They've got javelins and swords, and they're just great in melee. So definitely train these guys along the coasts. You're going to need to tech up your harbors as well as your military development to train them, and I do recommend it. Lasarnic Axemen. A lot of these units actually are going to be shared with the Reunited Kingdom, and Lasarnic Axemen is one of them. They can only be trained out of Arnak, which is the settlement in the mountains just to the west and slightly south of Minas Anor. So again, if you're going Ways of the West, that's a great settlement to go military, because these guys are going to give you some more armor piercing, and I just like them. I love these little regional units that you can train. Kind of your basic sword infantry as Ways of the West Adunabar is going to be these Adunabar swordsmen. They're very similar to the Kingdom's swordmen that you can train as the Reunited Kingdom. I believe they are a tier 2 unit, in some ways comparable to the Dark Swords, but you'll notice that the attack is a bit better, defense is a bit better, charge is the same. So the Ways of the West, in some ways, although the unit sizes are smaller, they tend to be a little bit higher quality than your cultic troops. Instead of Grim Spears, you're going to have a Adunabar militia, very, very similar indeed to the Kingdom militia of the Reunited Kingdom. And as Ways of the West Adunabar, you do get some interesting bodyguard units. The Nirn Guard, for example, are an infantry bodyguard with two-handed maces that, of course, can be trained out of Lond Nirnen, or the Nirn region, essentially. Now, you do start with a unit of these. I believe it's in the settlement which is to the southwest of the Sea of Nirn. There's a bodyguard in there, a family member, and he commands a unit of this Nirn Guard. So even though you are cultic at the beginning, you do start with some of these non-cultic units, so at least you get to play with them a bit. But this is a very fun unit to use. Very similar to any two-handed axe or two-handed sword infantry unit, in that you want to sort of clear the path for them by making sure that you've got enemy units pinned down and then have these guys crash into the flanks. All right, you also will get Royal Spearmen. These are kind of the counterpoint to Spears of the Shadow. Again, the attack is a bit better. The defense is the same. The charge is the same. A bit smaller unit size. So Royal Spearmen, a very solid unit. And Adunabar Macemen, this is another mace unit for Adunabar. We sort of imagined that would be kind of their thing. And so Adunabar Macemen are effective against armor. They're also shield wall capable, so just a really great unit to tech up to. Black Shields, I believe we talked about them a little bit already, and you saw them in the fight, but they're a shield wall capable sword infantry unit, extremely solid. Guards of the Tower. These, I believe, is this minus honor or minus Ithil? Well, you'll have to check in the campaign, because it's been a while, unfortunately, since I've played Ways of the West Adunabar, but these are similar to the Guards of the Citadel. It might be a minus Ithil specific unit, because minus Ithil is sort of perceived as the capital of Adunabar in some ways, or at least it's an important settlement for them, but maybe it's minus honor, so check that out. But either way, very similar to Guards of the Citadel, a very strong polearm unit. Hunters of Eriador are going to be available in Eriador, so that's in your northern settlements. If you go Ways of the West, you'll be able to train them, a very cost-effective archer unit, so highly recommended. Bowmen of Adunabar, this is your tier 2 Ways of the West archers, and again, pretty cost-effective, pretty solid, comparable to the Bowmen of Gondor that you can train in the Reunited Kingdom. Royal Rangers, these are an Ithilien-specific unit. So if you go, again, Ways of the West, I believe these would be in Emin Arnen that you can train them. Then definitely get these. Very similar, of course, to the Rangers of Ithilien, in that they are stealthy. They're bowmen with swords as a backup weapon. But the thing with them is you don't want to necessarily let them get into melee unless you can ensure that they can sneak around and hit from the flanks. And Blackroot Vale Bowmen, again, just like the Reunited Kingdom, if you get into Morthond, or Blackroot Vale, then you can eventually train these guys as the Ways of the West. So I think the advantage of these over, say, Longbowmen is the range. I think the Blackroot Vale Bowmen have the longest range of any of your ranged troops, but that's all in the description of the unit itself. You can check that out. We talked about and saw the Black Company, so that's, I believe, an Emin Arnen specific unit as well. And you do get Royal Longbowmen if you go Ways of the West as Adunabar. And then yet another archer unit. So again, Cultic Adunabar loses out on ranged variety, but does get a lot of orcs and other things. Ways of the West Adunabar gets a lot of ranged variety. So Royal Longbowmen are very similar to the King's Longbowmen. And Guards of the Haven, this is an Umbar specific unit with bows and spears. So an interesting versatile unit. And if you make Umbar a goal, which it seems perfectly reasonable for Adunabar, in my opinion, then this would be a nice prize for taking it. Another Ways of the West unit for you is Riders of Oriador. These are available up in the north. Kind of a Northman or middleman sort of cavalry unit with good armor and pretty light and fast, but you don't get a ton of cavalry as Adunabar no matter which way you go. Another cav unit that you do get, a lower tier one, is the Adunabar Horsemen. So it's funny, the Ways of the West Adunabar actually seems to get less cavalry, or at least less impressive cavalry, because these Shadow Riders, Knights of the Dark Tree, and so on, and even the Horsemen of the Shades are specific to the cult. But for somewhat of the compensation, Harondor Outriders are a very versatile and interesting unit for Ways of the West Adunabar. And Harondor, if you're going to Umbar, it's right on the way, just south of your starting position in Emin Arnin, in Ithilien. You just go south across the river and you are in Harondor. And it's very likely that Harondor will come into conflict with you, so you may as well take some of their land and train these Outriders while you do it, if you go Ways of the West. So these are Javelin cavalry, which I love as a unit type, and they have swords as well, good armor, and they're just a really cool looking unit too. So I think that does cover all of the units of Adunabar. This has been a longer than anticipated video, but it honestly doesn't surprise me on some level. Adunabar has a ton of stuff, and you can just easily think of different ways to combine these into your perfect 20 stack, right? If you're going to go cultic, you might want to have a fun rampaging orc army with beasts and wargs and orcs that's going to be relatively cheap, and you can send deep into enemy territory, and if it crashes and burns, who cares, because you've distracted the foe, and then you follow it up with a heavier cultic Manish roster stack to really take over the rest of the cities. Conversely, you could go Ways of the West and start to collect all these regional troops like the Lasarnik Axemen and the Blackroot Vale Bowmen and Harondor Outriders as you expand. So either way, there's a lot of fun to be had in playing around with a great variety of Adunabar's roster. So I hope this was helpful to you. I hope it was somewhat entertaining. And check out the channel for other updates. We're going to be doing some guides for all of the factions, hopefully, if I get around to it. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and have a great day. Bye-bye.